In the ancient palace of Belo, king of Egypt, two princes of opposite temperaments grew up, Danaus and Aegyptus. While the former cultivated silent cunning, the latter leaned toward military might and displays of power. Over time, the rivalry between the two brothers intensified, and each one's ambition began to endanger the family's fragile peace. Danaus, who eventually had 50 daughters, feared that Aegyptus, the father of 50 sons, would use these young men to subjugate him and seize all authority. Aegyptus, for his part, wanted to consolidate the lineage by proposing a massive marriage, his 50 sons to Danaus' 50 daughters. This plan, however, seemed more like a strategic move than a true family reconciliation. Suspecting Aegyptus' true intentions, Danaus ordered his daughters to accompany him on a nighttime escape. Under the cover of darkness and with the help of loyal servants, they silently left the royal palace. Their journey led them far from the sweltering heat of the Nile, crossing seas and storms until they reached Argos in the Greek peninsula, where Danaus hoped to find a safe haven. It was said that the blood of Io, an Argive princess turned into a cow by the will of Zeus, ran through the veins of Danaus' family. That ancestral bond allowed him to approach the king of Argos, who welcomed him hospitably, intrigued by the numerous daughters who accompanied him. However, the reputation of the Danaides and the echo of the enmity between Danaus and Aegyptus soon aroused curiosity and rumors in the city streets. After a few months, Aegyptus' 50 sons landed near Argos, determined to claim what they considered a promised marriage. They brought with them a small army and the threat of starting a war if Danaus refused to hand over his daughters. Under pressure, the local ruler urged Danaus to agree to the union in order to avoid a bloody conflict. Under those forced circumstances, a wedding celebration of astonishing proportions was arranged. 50 simultaneous weddings with decorated altars and the people of Argos looking on expectantly. While the final preparations were being made, Danaus continued to distrust. He watched his nephews with the wariness of one who sees potential enemies. Before him loomed the image of an imminent betrayal that he believed would destroy his daughters and himself. Thus, on the day of the weddings, when night fell and the couples withdrew to their chambers, Danaus secretly summoned his daughters. In a secluded room, he addressed them in a tense voice. "My dear daughters, this apparent union is nothing but a deception. Aegyptus and his sons will betray us sooner or later. They will use these weddings to subjugate us. We cannot allow it. Tomorrow, if those men remain alive, war will fall upon Argos. We must take the initiative." Some of the Danaides shuddered upon realizing what their father was demanding of them: to murder their husbands on their wedding night, when trust and intimacy were at their peak. To that end, Danaus provided them with daggers and ceremonial knives. It was a macabre plan that no daughter could ever have imagined. Nevertheless, fear and filial obedience led them to accept this command, except in the case of one, Hypermestra. Hypermestra had been wed to Lynceus, one of Aegyptus' sons who had shown a kind and respectful demeanor toward her. During the wedding banquet, he was gentle and considerate, and the young woman perceived a different sort of humanity in his eyes. When the time came to withdraw, Hypermestra remembered her father's words, but she also felt she could not stain her hands with the blood of an innocent man. In the darkness of the chamber, Lynceus caressed her hand and expressed his willingness to protect her. For Hypermestra, this gesture confirmed that he was not like the others, or at least not as Danaus feared. Alone, with a trembling knife in her hands, she realized she had to disobey her father if she did not want to become a murderer. That night, while the other sisters carried out the plan, Hypermestra spared Lynceus' life and agreed to flee with him before daybreak. The following morning, Argos awoke to a dreadful silence. With the first light of day, servants and townspeople discovered that in every bridal chamber lay a male corpse, blood staining the white beds, and the doors left ajar. Only Lynceus did not appear among the dead. He had escaped with Hypermestra. A clamor of horror and dismay shook the city, and rumors spread quickly. Danaus emerged from his chambers, surrounded by his daughters, who looked like ghosts overwhelmed by remorse and shock at their deeds. 50 men had fallen, but one had survived. It is said that upon learning this, Danaus flew into a rage, cursing Hypermestra's disobedience. To him, she had not only betrayed her father's trust, but also jeopardized the entire family's position. Danaus' vengeful nature demanded an immediate response to find her, judge her, and punish her for disobeying his command. Hypermestra and Lynceus' flight soon became public. Some citizens offered them shelter, moved by their love and by the apparent injustice surrounding Danaus' order. Seeing that the news was spreading, the king of Argos proposed a trial to clarify the situation. It was necessary to prevent the blood of Aegyptus' sons from now triggering a greater war. During the hearings, Danaus denounced Hypermestra as a traitor and claimed that her act endangered the stability of the city. Hypermestra, for her part, defended her innocence and maintained that she could not raise her hand against a man who had done nothing to her. Lynceus declared before everyone that he sought reconciliation, not vengeance. The crowd listened with interest and a certain sympathy. The rule of Argos did not need more violence, and the Danaides crime already seemed too heinous. The verdict favored Hypermestra, sparing her from punishment on the grounds that her piety outweighed her father's command. She was allowed to continue her life alongside Lynceus, while the other sisters remained in Argos, united with Danaus, who continued to display his firm and distrustful nature. Some sources indicate that, despite this ruling, Danaus reproached Hypermestra for her disobedience until the end of his days. News of these events reached the ears of the gods of Olympus, who regarded the tragedy with a mixture of indignation and surprise. Hera, goddess of marriage, felt particularly outraged, since those weddings had received her blessing, and the massacre directly violated her precepts. Zeus heard the charges with severity and determined that such a crime demanded a divine trial. Ares, god of war, was pleased that mortals were sinking into violence, while Athena was displeased by the lack of wisdom and understanding in Danaus' family. After some time, when the mortal lives of the Danaides came to an end, their souls would be taken before the gods to answer for their actions. According to the most widespread tradition, the verdict was unappealable. Those who had obeyed Danaus' order and killed their husbands would go to Tartarus. Their punishment, eternally remembered in stories, consisted of filling jars and pitchers riddled with holes with water, a futile task that symbolized the impossibility of atoning for the blood they had spilled. In the depths of the underworld ruled by Hades, gloom hovered over the souls of the condemned. The region of Tartarus, reserved for the greatest transgressors, spread out like a bottomless abyss, shrouded in a sepulchral chill. It was there that the 49 Danaides who had followed their father's murderous command arrived. The image of those daughters of Danaus, carrying pitchers in a hopeless back and forth, became one of the most desolate symbols in Greek mythology. Day after day, in an endless repetition, they had to draw water from an underground river and pour it into cracked or bottomless vessels. The water, slipping through each fissure, never filled the containers, condemning them to repeat their labor over and over again. The Danaides' laments echoed in the darkness, surrounded by unanswering echoes. It is said that some begged the gods for forgiveness, pleading for a chance to atone for their crime, while others remained in silent despair. The pitcher was raised, the water slipped away, and each drop fled like a constant reminder of their guilt. That fruitless labor was their way of grasping the gravity of the deed they had committed. A betrayal not only of sacred hospitality and family ties, but also of the marriage pact blessed by Hera. Some traditions suggest that, on rare occasions, the Danaides experienced small reprieves when the gloom of Tartarus was lifted by the intercession of compassionate gods such as Athena or Apollo. However, those moments of relief were never enough to fill their vessels. They soon returned to their endless toil, perpetually bound to the outcome of their blind obedience and the distrust that consumed Danaus. Unlike her sisters, Hypermestra was spared this torment. The gods recognized in her the piety and morality that led her to reject the atrocity. Thus, when she died, her soul received a different fate. In the memory of the Argives, Hypermestra and Lynceus became an exemplary couple, representing a possible path to reconciliation amid violence. Some versions say that they came to rule in Argos, others that they lived a simpler and longer life, blessed by divine favor. For the other Danaides, the punishment in Tartarus was the final reminder of the deadly trap they had fallen into. They allowed themselves to be swept away by their father's fears and resentments, believing there was no other way out but murder. That act sealed their fates and condemned them to perpetual suffering, a metaphor for the remorse that haunts those who break the most sacred bonds. Over time, the tragedy of the Danaides became one of the most significant tales in Greek mythology, symbolizing how blind obedience leads to terrible crimes and how the gods severely punish those who desecrate the rites of marriage and hospitality. The image of the 50 sisters in the eternity of Tartarus inspired poets, playwrights, and travelers who, centuries later, repeated that name with awe. The Danaides, women trapped between a father's will and a cruel fate. In this way, their story was preserved in songs and assemblies, conveying the warning that extreme passions, vengeance, fear, distrust, can drag mortals into the abyss. Danaus, blinded by his suspicion of Aegyptus, ordered his daughters to commit a horrifying crime. The Danaides, except for Hypermestra, obeyed without questioning the justice of that command. And although some of them may have wept inwardly over the deed once done, there was no divine mercy that could spare them from their sentence. The punishment in Tartarus is recounted with the same solemnity as other great mythical torments, such as those of Sisyphus or Tantalo. The image of the Danaides carrying broken pitchers highlights the magnitude of their guilt and the impossibility of cleansing it. No effort can restore the life they took or the honor tarnished at the weddings under Hera's aegis. Thus, the story of the Danaides was perpetuated in the oral and written tradition of Greece. Underlying it is the warning about how distrust leads to brutality. Likewise, there is a defense of piety, which, in the figure of Hypermestra, stands as an example that compassion can defy even the most unyielding orders. In the end, the decision to save Lynceus drew a moral line that neither a father's command nor the pressure of lineage could break, and so Hypermestra was spared the punishment imposed by the gods. My friends, who have sailed with me through these mythical waters where the Danaides weave their eternal fate between shadows and redemption, I thank you from the depths of my being for sharing this narrative journey. Like the waters of the Inachus River, which flow incessantly bearing the stories of the ancients, your presence has been the breath that brings life to these words. If these stories have touched the fibers of your soul, if you have felt the echo of the 50 sisters in your hearts, I invite you to join our community of dreamers and seekers of myths. Just as Hypermestra found the courage to choose her own destiny, I hope you will choose to accompany us on future journeys, along the paths of mythology by subscribing to this channel where legends come to life. Until our next meeting, when the torches are lit once more and new stories emerge from the depths of time. May the gods guide your steps, and may our paths meet again under the cloak of the eternal stars, like the water that never ceases to flow.